Welcome to the Aerospace Advantage podcast, brought to you by PenFed. I'm Doug Berkey, Executive Director here at Mitchel Institute. Here on the Aerospace Advantage, we explore the intersection of strategy, operational concepts, technology, and policy when it comes to air and space power. Now this week, we're taking a deep dive into deterrence, specifically deterring China from using force in space. The Air Force Air University's China Aerospace Studies Institute, or CASI for short, in partnership with the Center for Naval Analysis, CNA, just released a new report on this subject. And their report results, they're not looking good, just to be honest with you. In an examination of 10 different factors looking at how the U.S. can deter China, only 2 were rated as positively impacting deterrence. And while conflict in space isn't inevitable, the folks at CNA and CASI, they found out that we've got a long way to go when it comes to boosting our ability to deter conflict on orbit. We'll post a link to the report in our show notes. This is such an important and complex topic, and to help us better understand the report, its findings, its recommendations, we're excited to welcome a few of the China experts behind the study. With that, we've got Dr. Kevin Pollpeter, Director of Research at CASI. From CNA, we've also pleased to welcome April Herlevi and Elizabeth Barrett. I just want to thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Good to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
And then, last but not least, we've also got our own resident space experts here, Charles Galbreath and Jen Reeves. Guys, welcome back.
Thanks, Doug. Great to be back with you.
Glad to be here.
So, April, I want to begin with you. CNA sponsored this report. Can you help set the stage by providing a little background on CNA and your team's focus? I think it's really important to help people understand the groups and organizations involved, and you guys bring major talent.
Absolutely. Elizabeth and I are a member of the China and Indo-Pacific Security Affairs Division, where right now we have over 30 language-capable analysts studying China, the People's Liberation Army, security developments in the Indo-Pacific, strategic communications, and a variety of other topics.
In addition to what April mentioned, I think it's important to mention that CNA has partnered with CASI since 2018. This report is the result of those important collaborations. So I really hope that your listeners find this paper interesting and insightful.
That's awesome. I mean, that depth of talent, 30 experts on that. I'm impressed, guys. That's amazing. So, Kevin, bring us up to speed on the China Aerospace Studies Institute. What do you guys do? What's your background, your charter, all of that?
Sure. The China Aerospace Studies Institute is a part of the Department of the Air Force, so we serve both the Air Force and the Space Force. We are with the Air University down at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama. And our mandate basically is if China flies it, then we study it. So we look at aircraft, we look at both crewed and uncrewed, all aspects of space, missiles. We even delve into cyber and AI, and we look at the personnel issues, the doctrinal issues, operational issues associated with all of that. So we have 4 main missions that we carry out at CASI. The first one is research. So all of the reports that we do are unclassified and posted to our website. So feel free to put in CASI or the China Aerospace Studies Institute into your favorite web browser, and you can bring those up. We also do warfighter engagement, which is going out, participating in war games, education, which is teaching the Air Force and Space Force about China and the PLA, and then outreach, which is reaching out to our international allies and partners.
No, it's awesome. And you just said it. You guys are the expert on China, been at this for years. And so how would you characterize China's political and military objectives, particularly as they relate to space?
Okay, yeah, so you could probably spend a whole podcast just talking about this, but let me try and break it down. Really, what the Chinese Communist Party wants to do is they want to make China rich, strong, and respected. They would like to increase China's power and influence so that they can shape the international environment. They want to be able to make sure that the U.S. does not get in the way of their plans. And they also want to fend off challenges to its legitimacy, its reputation, and its capabilities, both at home and abroad. A critical part of this is technology and is the ability to independently develop high technology. Chinese leaders since Mao Zedong have stated that technology is the first productive force, right? Because it's really the basis of all national power. So where does space come into play with all of this? Space is viewed by China as one of the highest of high technologies. They've called it a new commanding height in strategic competition. And so when they look at how China's space program sort of benefits China. They look at it through making China rich through the economic benefits of commercial space. They look at it making China more respected by engaging in activities, let's say, such as human spaceflight and lunar exploration. And of course, space also makes China strong, right, through the military application. That's really what we're here to talk about today.
Yeah, that's really amazing. So in the report, you talk about different aspects of deterrence and how it's different than what some of our listeners might remember from the Cold War. You mind digging into that a little bit?
Sure. So I think there is some concern sort of broadly that continued effectiveness of deterrence is coming into question for both reasons that are geopolitical and technological. We see that China, Russia, Iran, North Korea are becoming more assertive in sort of challenging the U.S. politically and militarily, and they're developing the weapons and technology to be able to challenge the U.S. And so, in particular, China really stands out in this regard, right? And so there's really a combination of three factors that are making deterrence less effective. The PLA, the Chinese People's Liberation Army, has focused on exploiting key U.S. vulnerabilities, so developing asymmetric tactics, operational concepts, and technologies. And where space comes into play here is really with their development of counterspace technologies. And really what we've seen is China develop a broad suite of counterspace technologies, or at least counterspace-related technologies. We've got direct descent, kinetic kill vehicles. We have core orbital weapons, cyber, directed energy weapons, ground-based lasers, for example. And so when you couple this with their offensive military strategy, it's really designed to give China the upper hand. And so this ability sort of to sucker punch, if you will make China's leadership, could make China's leadership more confident that they could win a war against the U.S. The second factor then is when you're looking at space in particular, we see that counter space weapons have not really been fully tested in combat, right? And so there's a lot of maybe unknowns, or at least differing beliefs about their use and their risk and their escalatory potential and effectiveness. And so China may have different views of the way of how to use counter space weapons than the U.S. And then finally, what we haven't seen is a discussion about space technologies like we've seen in the Cold War era nuclear rivalry, right? We haven't seen the negotiations between the U.S. and China, or public statements, or signaling, or weapons acquisition that were intended to shape perceptions between the two powers. And so here we see that there's lack of dialogue, which may lead to misunderstanding and maybe more instability, which could make deterrence less effective.
No, that's really, really interesting. And I hadn't thought about some of those angles, so I appreciate that. Charles and Jen, what are your thoughts? I mean, you've seen this both from a uniform side and now your role at Mitchel.
Yeah, so deterrence is really complicated, and I'm glad that Kevin talked about the different aspects and what is potentially eroding the deterrent posture. But I think it's also important to reflect what General Saltzman said about deterrence. And he said, in the history of mankind, deterrence has only worked with nuclear weapons. Every other form of warfare has failed at deterring an adversary from taking an action. And as a result, we're really questioning what is the deterrent value of space. And Kevin, your comments about counter space capabilities being so new, it really raises the questions of how much is too much, when can I use it, when is it appropriate or not. It kind of reminds me of when I was a kid, my dad used to tell me, the little snakes, the baby snakes, are the ones you have to worry about because they don't know how much venom to put in you, and they're going to go all bore all the way in, and they could potentially deliver a larger impact. And so when we think about China and counterspace, if we ever do get into a conflict with them, or if tensions escalate beyond crisis, how much space will they want to attack, and how much of an impact will that have on us? So a lot to try to dissect and sift through.
Yeah, I got to say that General Saltzman's remarks from, I think, last July, we were almost completely finished with the report by then. So it's interesting how much his remarks matched up with our report. We approached the problem from different angles, but we came up with sort of the same conclusions.
So you know you're doing it right.
Exactly, hopefully.
Jen, thoughts?
Yeah, well, so it's interesting because early in the report, you guys mentioned that PLA researchers are perceiving space capabilities as a more usable and effective means of influencing an adversary, right? Not only before a conflict begins, but then into a conflict as well. So the issue is that they're already sort of getting after us. They're already attacking us with non-kinetic reversible effects like jammers and dazzlers. And I'm curious as to what you think that's about is, whether or not are we seeing effects that we're going to get more of when we actually do get in, if we actually get into an actual conflict with them, or is this really meant to be something that they want to use to deter us? And I'm so interested in how this works. It's such a complex concept and what is actually happening now and how it mixes in and meshes in with the concept.
No, totally. So let's pull the thread on that a little bit more. So if China is already attacking us, what exactly are we aiming to deter? I mean, is it all about escalation control, or what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, as we started to sort of flesh out some of the conclusions and implications of this report, it seems that we're probably not going to be able to deter all types of attacks against the U.S., especially those that may not be seen as the least escalatory. But at least maybe we can deter some of the higher-end attacks that, or at least preserve some sort of stability in the space environment, and maybe something that deter the more escalatory behaviors. So maybe we won't be able to deter, let's say, GPS jamming, but hopefully maybe we can prevent the widespread use of kinetic means. But I got to admit, even though we completed this report, there's still a lot of uncertainty here, at least with me. China appears to be treating space like any other warfighting domain, and their development of such a wide-ranging variety of counter-space capabilities suggests to me that deterring the full range of attacks against U.S. space assets may be really difficult.
Yeah, I just want to build a bit on what Kevin said, is because we're not going to be able to deter all behaviors, but I do think there's some areas that we point out in the report where there's maybe a little bit more hope to do so. For instance, deterring attacks on ground-based infrastructure, I think that's going to be easier to undertake than actually on satellites in orbit. There's a variety of reasons for that, some related to just the idea of personnel and international reputation costs. And as he already mentioned, kinetic versus non-kinetic attacks. So I do think if you look at it both by the type of weapon and where the attack would occur, there's going to be differences. And I think that's where we need to do more research, quite frankly, to understand those interactions.
When you talk about the escalation, GPS jamming will probably be inevitable. In fact, we're seeing it today. But an attack against the GPS constellation that could have a worldwide impact might be something that we can deter in the future. I also think it's interesting to examine the theory of competitive endurance here. And again, so the Space Force has laid this out, and they include in it the notion of conducting responsible counter-space campaigning as a means of controlling escalation. And to me, I interpret that a little bit like we might take some action in space. We might even allow some action in space, as long as it prevents a larger hostile action, maybe in the terrestrial sphere, in the air or land or maritime. And so maybe there's some attacks that we can do to deny China the use of their space to target us that would prevent them from maybe invading Taiwan, because they know that they can't hold us at risk out to the second or third island chain.
So I think, Charles, that's a really good way to start thinking. But then we also have to take it a step further, right? Because what happens should deterrence fail? Trying to overlay sort of the definitions of conflict onto a domain that's actually never seen it is a little challenging, right? What's a shooting war in space? So right now, I feel like everyone's sort of jockeying for some level of strategic advantage where there's no hostility actually happening in the domain. But some nations that we're talking about are actually dipping their toes, as it were, into what could be considered gray zone activities, right? By being non-kinetic, they're hard to attribute, easy to deny, but we're getting used to that to some level, right? So then what's next? There might be some posturing for what's next. And that is, we think about the Shenzhen 17 with its robotic arm. Like, what's the point of that? If it's not hostility, what's the point of that? And then we think about something perhaps like weaponized debris, right? 2007 was a big turning point for the entire spacefaring world. It's a big question about where we go, it seems so gently, from deterrence actually into some level of jockeying for strategic advantage and some rivalry, into gray zone activities, into no kidding hostility.
No, Jen, I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, we see that here on Earth where, look at cyber attacks or things like that. And that doesn't bring back the same level of response necessarily as a straight up kinetic attack. And how does that threshold work? It's really complex. So thanks for highlighting that. So Kevin, your report lays out 10 factors impacting the viability of deterrence. Unfortunately, it looks like only 2 positively support deterrence, while the other could lead to a more likely use of force. Can you walk us through what you call the deterrence scorecard?
Sure. So going into this project, we had the idea that we should step back and take a look at the deterrence literature going all the way back through to the first Cold War. And going through that literature, of course, most of that early literature focused on nuclear deterrence. And then we looked at more recent literature that looks more generally at deterrence. And the consensus view seems to be that there are many factors that influence deterrence besides the military balance, right? And that predicting whether deterrence will be effective is really difficult. Another theme that came through in the literature is that humans just aren't rational actors. It doesn't mean that we're crazy, right? But it does mean that when we go down to make a decision, we're not logically weighing the advantages and disadvantages or the cost and benefits of taking an action. There are lots of other sort of more emotional or non-tangible reasons why people make decisions.
Every time I deal with my teenage daughters, man.
Well, when we talk about leaders, though, right? So you can have the same effect. A lot of decisions are made on reasons other than the military balance, right? You can look at internal politics, pride, their worldview that are not really changeable by outside forces, right? And so in this report, we grouped together a group of 10 factors, and we divided those into 3 categories, right? So the first ones are those associated with the military balance and other types of aspects unique to the space domain. Second category was those that dealt with the challenger to a system, or in this case, China. And then the third one, dealing with international norms and signaling. So let me take on the first 4, dealing with the military balance, and I'm going to hand it over to my colleagues, April and Liz, to go through the other ones. So real quickly here, the first factor is military balance, right? So that's really the traditional way of trying to determine whether deterrence will be effective. In this case, the U.S. is still reigns supreme. We have the best military in the world, right? We still have the strongest, best space program in the world. So we figure that this is probably going to increase the deterrent effect, right? But then you look at other factors, and there may be less so, right? So the second factor is whether the challenger has an offensive military doctrine. And here, if you look at the PRC, their military strategy is active defense. Even though there's defense in the name, actually it's a very offensive-oriented strategy that takes into account preemption and striking first. And then when you couple that with the traditional thinking that outer space is an offense domain or offense-dominant domain, it could encourage China to think about striking in space first to gain an advantage. The third factor is ambiguity of intentions, right? And both the U.S. and China have been a little bit reticent about stating exactly what would happen if somebody attacked their space assets. And in fact, China still really doesn't really admit that it has any space weapons. And so if we go back to our Deterrent 101 class, right, the 3 factors of deterrence, you need a capability, you need the will to use it, and then you need communication to signal that you have both the will and capability. And that's one area maybe where we're lacking a little bit now. So that decreases the value of deterrence. And then fourth, there's the prevalence of uncrewed systems, right? Right now, 10 people up in space, right? 7 in the ISS, 3 in China's Tiangong space station, but all the other satellites are uncrewed. And so if there isn't that escalatory potential about killing people or harming people in those attacks, it may make states, in this case China, more willing to attack those assets, just simply because they're not as escalatory as, let's say, shooting down an airplane or sinking a ship that has people on it. And I'm going to turn over to April and let her take on the next few factors.
As Kevin mentioned, when we did our original literature review for this study, I pulled a quote from Thomas Schelling that I thought was really apt from his 1966 book, Arms and Influence. And in that, he wrote, "China is a different strategic problem altogether." And so basically, we wanted to take that prediction very seriously. We think it is a different set of circumstances than it was during the Cold War. So for challenger views, we focused on 3 factors: China's perceptions of the international system, both generally and as it relates to space, space asymmetry, and China's growing dependence on space. So in terms of views of the international system, China has publicly expressed dissatisfaction with the current international order, and the PRC's space narrative parallels that larger narrative. And I think that dissatisfaction has only grown in the past several years. We've seen more and more statements out of China trying to take a more leadership role. So we do think we need to take that seriously. In terms of space asymmetry, PLA researchers assess that space capabilities play an outsized role that is distinct from other forms of military power. We've sort of talked about this already, but there's this perception that space capabilities, because of their unique characteristics, might be more usable and an effective means of influencing the adversary. So this is the comment earlier about, is this about deterrence or is it about actual operation and conflict? I think it's both. So the PLA is taking those very seriously. However, the third factor we looked at in terms of challenger views is China is significantly expanding its own space architecture. And as the PLA is increasingly dependent on that architecture, it could curtail inclinations to have space-based attacks. We also think because China is really increasing the size of its commercial low Earth orbit constellations, the risk there in terms of damaging the commercial sector could also be more problematic. So that's why this is one of the two factors in the report that we think could actually increase deterrence effectiveness. And with that, I'll turn it over to Liz to talk about international signaling.
Thanks. So international norms, we've got the Outer Space Treaty, we have the International Telecommunication Union, and they do establish some norms. However, they don't cover all of the activities that are possible in space. The European Union tried to create a space code of conduct, and not enough countries supported it. The United States in 2022 said that it would conduct no more ASAT tests. But that doesn't mean every other country is going to.
That was debris-causing tests, right?
Yes.
Because the concern was creating long-lived debris that could impact all spacefaring nations.
Correct.
Right? Okay.
Yeah. And then when that was brought forth to the UN as a potential resolution, China and Russia, both who have satellites in orbit, they voted against it. China also views outer space as a warfighting domain that in any future war has to be held. They have to fight for it, they have to gain it, they have to keep it. But the Outer Space Treaty says that you cannot by any means claim sovereignty over outer space. And these two ideas, in my opinion, definitely conflict. They can risk creating a conflicting signal and risk being seen as provocative, even if the genuine attempt and meaning behind that message is not what it seems. And so while reassurance and positive inducements from a deterring state, so for instance, the United States trying to deter China, they can be viewed as an effective means, but in reality, we've seen that that might not necessarily be the case.
They just don't trust us.
Yeah. Yes, especially with relations, bilateral relations as they are right now.
Right.
No, that's a great summary, guys. I really appreciate it.
Manage your money on your time with 24/7 digital banking on the PenFed mobile app. Easily make payments, transfer funds, and deposit checks through mobile deposit.
That's music to my ears.
Learn more at penfed.org. Federally insured by NCOA.
So I want to talk a little bit more about the two factors positively supporting deterrence. I mean, there's a current imbalance of power in favor of the United States, and then there's a growing dependence on space. And these seem to be somewhat related. I mean, the current imbalance driving China to increase its use of space, and it seems counterintuitive that a growing Chinese space capability might support some level of stability. So am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, so our thinking here is that China appears to be, they are building out a robust space-based C4 ISR architecture, right? That some are even calling a kill mesh, right? We're getting rid of the kill chain terminology and now talking about kill mesh, right? So our thinking was that if China is becoming as invested in space as the United States, then maybe there will be a little bit of self-deterrence involved here. Well, they will say, hey, we want to maintain those capabilities, much like the U.S. wants to maintain its own capabilities. And maybe the best way is not to engage in some sort of catastrophic form of space warfare. So maybe there could be some sort of accommodation here, much like mutually assured destruction concept during the Cold War with nuclear weapons. So there's a certain deterrence logic to that thinking. Will it hold up under operational imperatives? That, to me, at least, is still an open question.
Yeah. So there are two negative factors also related here.
I think maybe April wanted to chime in.
No problem. April, hop in.
Well, I mean, I already kind of touched on it in the previous answer, but I think for China, one of the big things to keep in mind is for most of the last several decades, the focus has been on their Beidou network, not so much on commercial satellites. But now there is a widespread interest at both the provincial level, private companies. There's a whole range of actors trying to build up the commercial space architecture for China. And that's, I would say, a relatively recent development. So if we see them achieve the goals they want to achieve, I mean, I've heard estimates of up to 45,000 satellites by mid-century. I mean, I think some of those are probably not going to be achieved, but if they did, it's going to make any sort of debris-causing attack space really damaging to a whole range of other issues. So I think we know that economic growth is so imperative and important for China. So the more they build out their commercial space structure, I think that could support a higher level of stability.
But there are two negative factors also related here. China, the challenger, being dissatisfied with the status quo, and then the asymmetry in space capabilities between the U.S. and China. So, Kevin, can you help distinguish these factors from the others?
Sure. So our thinking here was based on something called prospect theory. And prospect theory states that people make decisions based on whether they're perceived to be a net gain or a net loss for them, and that people will more strongly react to preventing a loss than they will to getting a gain. Let me bring that down to a practical level. So it's likely that we're probably going to be more unhappy at losing $10 than happy to have found $10, right? So we're always concentrated more on the losses. And so I think it's pretty safe to say that China is not happy with the U.S.-led international system, right? We can make all the reasoned arguments to China about how much they benefited under our system, but in the end, they don't care, right? They don't want us to dictate to them how they should act. And they believe that the U.S. is keeping them down, right? So they're concentrated on the losses that they're being inflicted on them from the U.S.-led international system. And so what we see in the deterrence literature is that countries that harbor deep-seated grievances or more highly value honor may be less deterrable. And I think that's what we have with China.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Well, I want to just build one point on Kevin's point, too, is that the idea of losing Taiwan for the senior leadership in Beijing is really, it fits this prospect theory framework really well, because losing that, so for instance, Taiwan declaring independence is a way bigger deal and a much higher loss of face for the PRC leadership than it kind of dragging on indefinitely. So that's one reason we thought this framework was so useful as you look at Chinese strategic thinking.
And so when you want to apply that to the space environment, then really China views the United States as trying to restrict China's access to space, trying to restrict space technologies, developing counter space weapons to take out Chinese satellites. So they feel themselves definitely that they are the ones being denied, or at least the U.S. is trying to deny them access to the space environment, which contributes to their sense of grievance.
The report also references the security dilemma. That's when a state seeks to improve its security, those actions might be perceived as potentially threatening to another state. This and the possibility of the growing use of space by China contributing to stability really speak to the complexity of the deterrent challenge. As I was reading that section, it made me think about the line from The Two Towers when Pippin says, "The closer we are to danger, the further we are from harm." And so with China developing counter space capabilities and developing its own space capabilities, does that actually support a level of stability that we might not like but have to live with? What sort of recommendations are you making in the report when it comes to counter space capabilities and whether or not we should be able to deny China their use of space? And does that potentially threatening action actually make us more stable?
Right. So I think the idea here was that if we are going to try and deter China from attacking us in space, we should do more than just take passive measures, right? We should do more than just have better space domain awareness and better resiliency. We need to be able to demonstrate to China that attacking our space assets will result in actions that will harm them. If China can just sit back and plink away at our satellites all day, without any retaliatory U.S. action, really they have nothing to lose, right? So we'll probably have a better chance of deterring China if we take both a deterrence by denial approach as well as a deterrence by punishment approach.
I just want to add on to that too. First, I love any Lord of the Rings analogy, so I appreciate that a whole lot. But that's one reason we talk so much about signaling, reassurance, and international norms in the report, because my opinion is the closer we are to danger, the more we need those robust methods of communicating our intentions. I think sometimes people forget that during the Cold War, even when tensions were extremely high, there was regular interactions and dialogue between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Now, they were fraught with complexity and difficulty, but in some ways, we don't have that. We don't have a baseline. And often China will just cut off communications when they are unhappy. So our concern is that there aren't those clear ways to reassure and or signal intentions in the current environment.
Boy, listening to this, Jen, I'm reminded of you growing up in Berlin during the Cold War. You talk about signaling and in the heart of that.
Oh, 100%. Yes. So I did grow up in Berlin. I was getting there when I was a little girl in 1977 until the wall did come down in 1989. And yes, there were very sort of set norms of behavior. And if anyone went outside those norms, either side, it was very clear that something was up. And it may not be what was actually happening in the moment. It very often was signaling that something else was going on between, the two big nation states that involved in the Cold War. Yeah, it was very much in my face growing up with it. It was quite interesting.
And to be clear, Jen, you were on the west side of West Berlin, right?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Okay, great.
The
Thanks.
west side of West Berlin, with all of Berlin being in East Germany.
Yeah.
So the wall was around us. Oh, by the way, most people don't recognize that, but the wall was around us.
Man, it's wild. Back to the future. So there are some other factors I'd like to discuss. Building off the need to develop counter-space capabilities, the report also lists treating space as a warfighting domain as decreasing deterrence. Can you elaborate on this a bit?
Sure. So our thinking was that if both the United States and China were to treat space like a sanctuary or not plan to attack space assets, or if losing space assets would be so catastrophic they wanted to refrain from doing so, then deterrence would be mutually reinforcing, right? Sort of like mutually assured destruction in the nuclear realm, right? But I'm not sure that's the case today, right? We have both the U.S. and China are now talking about taking actions against the other space-based C4ISR systems. So that suggests to me that both sides see the denial of space as integral to achieving victory, and that is going to lessen that deterrence value.
So just to put a little historical context on that, we demonstrated the utility of space for terrestrial warfighting in Desert Storm and in multiple operations after that. As a result, China said the United States' over-reliance on space might be their Achilles heel, and we need to have the ability to deny the United States the use of space, and therefore we're going to develop counter-space weapons. So they really started us on this path of potentially developing and employing weapons to deny another state's use of space. And that's what made us recognize, hey, space is a warfighter domain. We've got to protect ourselves, and we've got to be able to take some actions as well.
Right. That's exactly right.
So another factor that lowers the threshold for use of force is the fact that space systems are almost always uncrewed. As a result, the report states that the costs of attacking space systems, they might be lower. And you're not talking about crewed military systems, right? I mean, it's more about the general lack of people in space, just to clarify here.
That's exactly right. So, it's said in our field that satellites do not have mothers, right? So we've seen in the air and space domains that taking out uncrewed systems do not appear to generate the same sort of reaction that losing crewed systems do. So I would also suspect that's the same for the space domain.
No,
really. Well, and interestingly, last fall, we at the Mitchel Institute held a workshop that we called our Space Endurance Workshop. We pulled together 55 experts from across the national security space enterprise, and we looked at these 6 scenarios and essentially how to not let them bubble over into conflict using the tenets of the Space Force's theory of competitive endurance. So, and what we did find is that it was actually challenging to get a sense of urgency, really the sense of gravitas, if you will, when life and limb were not in peril. So I think it's really challenging when the fight is far away from the humans.
Yeah, and Kevin, like you said, the old saying is satellites don't have mothers. But the thing is, we have to remember that the systems and the pilots and the air crews, the ships, the soldiers in the field, they all rely on space. And so there is a secondary effect, and all of those warfighters have mothers. So we have to take a look at that. And while there's only 10 people in orbit today, we know that that's going to grow over time. And as we venture out further into the cislunar domain and out to Mars, we know that there will be more people in space. And so one of the things we're going to look at our next workshop, Jen talked about our last workshop focusing on competitive endurance. We're going to take a look at conflict in space this October and what impact having humans potentially doing military missions in space might have on the calculus of potential adversaries as well as the United States when it comes to actually conducting a conflict in space.
Nah, it's really important. So I want to pull a different thread. People are citizens of a nation, even in space. But, when you think about space, the idea of sovereign territory, it's kind of different. And the report doesn't list this as one of the 10 factors, but it does discuss the lack of sovereignty as increasing the chances of provocative actions. Would declaring satellites as sovereign territories, would it support deterrence?
Yeah, I'm not sure it would. I'm not sure the PRC would care. Although I must say that PRC writings are varied on this topic. Some sources think that this type of action would be a bluff on the part of the United States. Other sources seem to take it more seriously. On the other hand, if we designate satellites as sovereign territory, does that force us into taking more escalatory action? It reduces our freedom of maneuver, and that could also be detrimental to escalation control and deterrence.
Yeah, Liz talked about the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, and it's kind of crazy to think that some of the governing policies that we have and rules in the international community are based off of 1967 here in 2025. But that is still the law of the land, if you will. And it talks about there is no sovereignty, no claim by any nation of celestial body. And so it raises the question of if we start to refine and advance some of the thinking, some of the legal framework, if you will, for space, does that actually create more problems for us to try to have to solve and add complexity to what right now is a fairly black and white issue of no, they're not sovereign territory?
So the last factor I'd like to discuss is the ambiguity associated with space. And there's a double whammy here. I mean, first, space is big. Monitoring everything everywhere, it's impossible. And that means attribution. It's going to be a challenge. And two, space remains highly cloaked in layers of secrecy. Not just the United States, but China's activities too. And as a result, you think about it, intentions and capabilities are difficult to discern. So what does your analysis suggest about the ways to mitigate this?
So one is obviously to improve space domain awareness, or SDA. Effective SDA can enhance space deterrence and reduce the chances of inadvertent escalation. If we know why a satellite failed, for example, was it a malfunction, was it due to debris, or was it a result of an attack, we don't get into a war accidentally, and then we also know who to attribute the attack to. Second, there's been more discussion now with entering the third year of the Russia-Ukraine war, the possibility of a war between the U.S. and China becoming a protracted war, right? And that's probably also something that we need to consider when looking at the space environment. Space is often thought of as an offense-dominant domain, and that means that states can be more aggressive. They can prioritize striking first. They can use brinkmanship and fates accompli, so it reduces the room for diplomatic measures. And this is also important because when you apply it to China, right, as we've already talked about, Chinese PLA operations are inherently offensive and stress conducting strong strikes at the beginning of a campaign. They especially emphasize striking first in space. So getting back to your question about it remains highly cloaked in layers of secrecy, we can sort of buy back some resiliency or prepare for that, for those unknowns by having a more resilient space architecture. By having a more resilient space architecture, we can take that first blow, right, and can then continue on with the mission. We see that now happening with proliferated LEO constellations, right, with Starlink use in Ukraine. But then on the other hand, we're seeing China starting to invest in some of the same technologies, right? As April mentioned, we could have a Chinese constellation or various constellations that number 40,000, 50,000 satellites. So we'll see how that works out in regards to deterrence, though.
The report concludes with a set of recommendations with some that mirror the three tenets of the Space Force's theory of competitive endurance. And they deal with increasing resiliency to deny first-mover advantage, increasing domain awareness to avoid operational surprise, and the ability to conduct counter-space operations. The Space Force, they're definitely moving out on all three of these. But are there other steps that they should be pursuing?
Yeah, I think that when you take everything together, adding resiliency, improving space domain awareness capabilities, conducting counter space operations, I think it really speaks to the need for the Space Force to develop itself as a warfighting force, and that any deterrence value will be achieved through that effort rather than having deterrence be the number one priority. I think as we've been talking about during this podcast, achieving deterrence is going to be uncertain anyway, and the operational imperative is there for making Space Force into a real warfighting force. So I think it's best to develop that Space Force into that warfighting force, be able to develop it into something that can take what is thrown at it, right, and then be able to continue on to the mission, and then also then take it to the enemy. A second comment I guess I would make would get back to the Deterrence 101, right? We need the capability, we need the will to use them, and then the communication to signal that we have the capability and will. And I would offer up that we need to thinking more about how to best communicate our deterrence message in space. Space has long been a domain where secrecy has reigned supreme, right? But if we are to have effective deterrence in space, we're going to have to be more open about what we are doing in space. We see that happening more with space domain awareness, right? The Space Force is putting out their quarterly fact sheets, right? But then we also need to be thinking about what is, on the counterspace side, what is the balance between reveal and conceal? How much do we make known publicly or non-publicly to the PRC to change its calculus? Do we need to have some sort of declaratory policy in regards to space weapons? So just thinking through some of these issues to make that signaling stronger.
Yeah, and to build on that point a little bit further, actually in earlier drafts of this report, we did have a few debates about how much to get into the signaling literature from the academic community. There's a really robust literature that gets into a lot of that, and it's a really critical component of coercion theory generally and deterrence specifically. But what we decided for this report, what made the most sense was to really just thinking about what scenarios might we encounter in the future and how might the U.S. react to those scenarios. And at that stage, then you can think about what message do you craft that both communicates what U.S. reactions to any Chinese actions would be, because I really think crafting the right message, deciding how to deliver that message through what formats, and clarifying actions that would occur in the event of a particular scenario, all of those communication messaging aspects take time to put forth. And as I said, it's not the Cold War. There's not a framework by which to do this right now. So I think each of those elements are going to take time for us to figure out what is the effective signaling mechanisms between the US and China in the space domain.
And also, there is no red phone, right? The line between Washington, D.C. and Moscow, whatever that was called, I don't remember. But right,
the hotline.
It was the hotline, exactly. So yeah, that doesn't exist with us in China. I mean, maybe it should. Maybe we should talk about something like that. Well, if I could, I want to pile on and talk about something that I think is challenging. And, I already mentioned having grown up in Europe during the Cold War, I think that the lack of norms is a real challenge in this day and age. And I know you guys mentioned in the report that for the immediate situation that we're in, it's probably not relevant, but that it might be long-term. I agree with that wholeheartedly, because I think the norms of behavior on a national level is what allows us to also create some level of policy that maybe we could convince other nations to stick with. I don't think we're ever going to get an outer space treaty with 114 signatories. I don't think that's ever going to happen again. But I also feel like the situation that we're in with our only policy being so old that we've had in the last 18 years now, many nations that have walked up to that line and just crossed it because we don't have what I think would be something that is applicable to this time and this strategic environment. So in my mind, even if it's not really that stringent, like, hey, we'll never do this, I mean, really hard lines, something that more people can sign up to, I think will pay off, in the long run, right? Who knew sitting here today that the treaty that was signed in 1967 would still have the effect that it's having today? I'm confident the people who prepared that document were not thinking what it looks like today. So I think my vote is that we need some additional policy and norm set up as best we can for the entire international.
Yeah, Jen, I agree with you that that is an important step. And it's unfortunate that many of the norms that we have internationally come about after a bad incident has occurred. And it's after the fact that we're saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't do that. And what we need to try to do in space, because the ramifications of a bad event happening in space could be years of debris that make certain orbital regimes unusable. We need to look proactively and try to think about what problems we can avoid rather than correcting problems that have already occurred. But back to what Kevin talked about, and it's in this report, is those elements of competitive endurance, of counter-space campaigning, and domain awareness, and building in additional resilience. Those are absolutely critical to helping deter potential hostilities from escalating. But I want to pull on a thread, and that is the signaling piece, the communication piece. One aspect of signaling is the perception. And it's not just what we intend to say and therefore say it, but also how will China perceive those actions and interpret them? And will our actions actually be productive in deterring and de-escalating, or could they be misinterpreted because of the different cultures and mindsets and views between the United States and the West and China?
Right. So that's going to be a problem. Right now, the relationship between our two countries is not so good, to put it mildly. And so that China's in the mind frame of looking at just about everything the U.S. does in a very negative light. So it's easy for them, or they're more prone, I should say, to maybe looking at us for having the worst intentions. And so that's something we're going to have to be careful about.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate predicament that they are looking up to us as they are the challenger, and they think everything we're doing is to try to keep them down, when that is not the case. However, if they do attack us, we're still going to kick their butt.
I want to build on a little bit, though. I agree that it's a fraught time. I mean, this is a very challenging time in U.S.-China relations. But I also, and this is a shout out to some of my other colleagues at CNA, we have a whole team that looks at strategic communications. And there is a growing body of literature that understands both how China conveys its messages, so the kind of veiled language they use to talk about strategic issues, and how they interpret our work. And I know one of my missions throughout my time at CNA has been making sure folks across the military understand that. And I think that knowledge and expertise has improved tremendously over the last 5 years. But I think there's probably more work to be done across other elements of the U.S. government, just understanding when China says certain things that might not be very clear. What does that mean? How does that fit into how they communicate? So I think there's work that can be done there, especially as it relates specifically to the space domain.
Awesome. Thank you.
Now, I can't thank everybody enough for their time today. And I just want to encourage our listeners. We've included a link to the report in the show notes. You can also just Google it. But bottom line, Kevin, Charles, Boots, April, Elizabeth, it's been awesome to have you here. This is such an important topic. Cannot thank you all enough for your time.
Thank you for having us. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
Thank you all for joining us. It's been great.
Thanks so much, you guys. This has been so awesome.
With that, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our guests for joining in today's discussion. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to you, our listeners, for your continued support and for tuning into today's show. If you like what you heard, don't forget to hit the like button and follow or subscribe to the Aerospace Advantage. You can also leave a comment to let us know what you think about our show or areas that you'd like to see further exploration. And as always, you can join in the conversation by following Mitchel Institute on X, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn. And you can always find us at mitchelaerospacepower.org. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time. Okay, all things go back to Dr. Strangelove. We need to have the hotline so you can call Dimitri.
That's right.
I really wanted to
up.
put that in the paper.
Right?
Cannot afford a mineshaft gap.
That's what I'm saying. And if we have the
hilarious.
doomsday machine and nobody knows about
Well,
it,
see, that's what I was thinking about with signal. You need to be able to tell,
That's right. There's no point in having a weapon if they don't know. You can't have
Yeah.
deterrence if it's a secret.
The Prime Minister, I think,
So
likes
true.
surprises. I thought, no, we're going to get off track. Got to stay on target.
No, that's